You guys are looking at me kind of funny. Do I have something on my face? What is going on, Raiders? Soda Dragon here, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to separate your good gear from your junk. But before that, I wanted to introduce you to my bearded dragon, Lychee. She is the sweetest, most gentlest bearded dragon in the world, and she just wanted to stop by and say hi. Alright guys, on to the gear cleanse. But before we get to what you should sell and what you shouldn't, really it's good to understand what the gear sets are for, their value, and how useful they can be to you in the long run. Really, if you don't understand that, then you're not going to really cleanse your gear well. That means you might keep things you don't need, you might keep things that are not useful, and you might not farm things that could be really useful to you in the future. So what I'm going to try to do is explain all the different gear sets to you, their uses, and what I think their viability is as far as end game or maybe just early game usage. So guys, before you start cleansing your gear, I think the first thing you need to think about is, do you have to? Now, it's one thing if you need to sell your gear to get silver. It's another thing if you don't need the silver. So if you don't need the silver and you have the capacity, especially early game, keep your gear, all right? You never know when you're gonna need a weird, odd combination in your sets or your substats. Now I'm gonna show you the most common substats that are used with different gear sets, but sometimes, yeah, you need some weird combination. And if you sell all your gear too early, especially when you're not close to being full capacity, then potentially you're missing out on using a gear piece, even though it's not common, that you would have needed. So I would recommend, if you're not close to full capacity and you don't need the extra silver, just keep your gear, all right? Now, once you're getting close to 1,000, yeah, it's about time to start cleansing. But before then, and once again, especially early game, go ahead and keep your gear, all right? You never know when you're gonna need those pieces. So what are we looking at in our gear when we're deciding what to keep and what to sell? Well, the number one thing you're looking at when deciding what to keep is, does it have a speed substat? Now, of course, if you're talking about speed boots, they won't have a speed substat. That's separate. But besides that, does your piece of gear, whatever set it is, have a speed substat? Speed is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable stats in the game. So ideally, you want speed on really all your pieces of gear. That's really what you're looking for. Now, there is one set in which speed is not the number one substat that we're looking at. We'll talk about that later. But besides that one set, really, speed is great on every single piece of gear that you can have it on. So when we're thinking about what gear to keep, we're really thinking about what substats go best along with that gear's purpose. Okay, so every gear set has a purpose, or it has an ability, it has some effect, it has some benefit. So what substats go best along with that set's purpose? That's really what we're looking at. So, in order to answer that, you need to know the set's purpose, what it's used for, at least most commonly, and what it's good at. So that is something that we'll talk about with the gear sets. Another thing is, typically you want your gear sets to specialize. That is, do something really well. So instead of being a jack of all trades, really hone in and do one thing really well. So if you're talking about a savage set, what do you want it to do really well? Do damage, all right? You don't really care about certain survivability stats when you're talking about savage gear, because really that's not its purpose. And you end up making that gear a sort of jack of all trades instead of specializing. So really what we're trying to do with our gear and picking the right pieces is allowing those gear sets to specialize in certain things. So that will get you further in this game. That is the specialization in our gear, rather than trying to make all our gear pieces a jack of all trades. And lastly, guys, try to keep at least one good set of every gear type, because you never know when you'll need it. All right, guys, on to our first set. This is the life set. So a 2-piece set gives you plus 15% HP. So what subsets are we looking at prioritizing? Well, firstly, the speed, as you mentioned before. Secondly is HP percentage. Remember, you're putting on this gear to get more health, to get more HP. So obviously, if you have pieces with additional HP percentage substats, all the better, because that goes along with the purpose of putting on this gear, getting more HP, right? So what about the later priorities, third and fourth priorities? They could be crit rate and crit damage. So why is this? Because some champs, they do damage based on their max HP. So people like Santa or Versolf the Grim, they do damage based on their max HP. So the higher max HP they have, the more damage they'll do. So in those cases, yes, you actually do want substats like crit rate and crit damage, because we're not talking pure survivability, but we're actually talking about doing damage. So you may want to keep some pieces with that crit rate and the crit damage for those HP based damage dealers if you have any. So what about the gloves? Well, you want HP percentage most of the time, especially for survivability. And as we mentioned before, if you're talking about damage dealing HP based champ, then you want that crit rate or crit damage glove. So what about the chest piece? You want an HP percentage chest piece. And what about the boots? Well, speed boots are a great choice in really virtually all of your gear. So definitely have the speed boot available, but HP percentage boot, depending on how strong your speed substats are in total in all your gear, you may be able to get away with an HP percentage boot as well. But if you feel like you're too slow, definitely slap on that speed boot. You cannot go wrong with a speed boot. If you guys didn't know, one cool thing about HP based damage dealers is you cannot reduce their damage, unlike their attack based damage dealing counterparts and their defense based damage dealing counterparts. So for those attack based damage dealers, you can't put that decreased attack debuff on them and that will decrease their damage, right? Same thing with defense based damage dealers. You can't put that decreased defense debuff on them and that will decrease their damage. But HP based damage dealers, you cannot. They will always do the same damage. Now you cannot increase it. For example, increase attack buff, increase defense buff, but you cannot decrease it as well. So you're going to get steady damage out of your HP based damage dealing champs. So what about the end game or even mid game viability of the life set? Well, really, this is not a set that is going to prove to be too much use for you mid game or late game because of the immortal set. So the immortal set functions in a very similar way. You get that plus 15% HP boost, but you get a slight regen effect as well. And if you're farming the clan boss every single day, then you're potentially getting immortal pieces every day. So even though the set itself is not directly farmable, it's going to feel like it's farmable if you're doing your clan boss every day. You're going to get a lot of those immortal pieces, and those immortal pieces are a lot better than life pieces. So really, you're not going to find too much end game or even mid game usefulness for the life set because you're going to be getting so many immortal pieces, and really those immortal pieces are superior. All right, guys, on to the offense set. So this two-piece set gives us plus 15% to the attack stat. So you will be using this on your damage dealers whose damage is based on the attack stat. So what should we prioritize with regard to the substats for this piece of gear? So really, we're looking at number one, speed, the speed substat, ideally. Now, what about the rest? The rest is split between attack percentage, crit rate, and crit damage. Once again, attack percentage, crit rate, and crit damage. So what gloves are we looking at using? Well, we want either the crit damage or the crit rate glove. So depending on your substats, you might go with a crit damage glove if your crit rate in the substats for the rest of your gear is really good. If your crit rate in your substats is not good, then you're going to need to go with a crit rate glove. Now, what about the attack glove? Either flat attack or attack percentage glove. Not that useful. It's one of the least used gloves in this game, even with attack-based damage dealers, all right? Now, you can keep a pair or two if you want, but really, they are not that useful. They just do not do as much damage as the crit rate or crit damage glove. That's why, even on your attack-based damage dealers. So early game, really, I know it's counterintuitive, but that attack percentage or flat attack glove, you're really not gonna get as much damage out of it as a crit rate or crit damage glove. So what about the chest? So really, to do the most damage, you want an attack percentage chest. But a good backup, it's good to keep a few pieces of this, would be HP percentage. Sometimes your damage dealers are too squishy, they're too frail. So in order to keep some of their damage, but also give them a little bit of survivability, you're gonna put on that HP percentage chest. So keep a few of those HP percentage chests as well. So what about the boot? Ideally speed boot, okay? You really cannot be too fast in this game, but definitely you can be too slow. Now, in certain instances, you can use an attack percentage boot. That is an option in certain cases, but more than likely, except for those rare exceptions, and unless you have really awesome speed substats in the rest of your gear, you're going to be using a speed boot, okay? But keep a few attack percentage boots around. Not like you'll use them that much, because a slow attacker is useless. They'll die before they get a chance to attack. But you can make use of them in the mid to end game. So keep a few around. So what about the mid game to end game viability of the offense set? Well, chances are you won't be using them a ton because you'll be getting cruel sets. So we get those from the clan boss, and they're a straight upgrade from the offense set. So not only are we getting the plus 15% to the attack stat, but we are ignoring 5% of the enemy's defense per 2-piece set. So we put 3 of those sets on, all of a sudden we're ignoring 15% of the enemy's defense, which is huge. That is a huge way to do big damage numbers, to ignore defense. This is one of the reasons that Savage is so good as a set, because you ignore so much defense. So here we can get that daily really from the clan boss. So chances are you won't really be using those offense pieces in the mid to end game, but you're going to be really relying on those cruel pieces that you get daily. All right, guys, on to the defense set. So here we're looking at plus 15% to the defense stat per 2-piece set. So what stats are we looking at prioritizing with our defense gear? So number 1 is going to be the speed substat. Number 2 is going to be the defense percentage substat. Number 3 and number 4, depending if you have a defense-based damage dealer, is going to be your crit rate and crit damage. So if you're lucky you got a Solus or somebody like that, then yes, you're going to want not only defense pieces that have defense percentage, but also have that crit rate and crit damage. So what about the glove? Really, you're looking at either survivability or doing damage. So if you're talking about someone like a War Chief whose damage multipliers are not that good, then you want a defense percentage glove. But if you're looking at someone like Solus whose damage multipliers are good, so huge damage potential, then you want that crit rate and crit damage glove. So what about the chest piece? We're looking at defense percentage. Now what about the boots? Ideally speed boot. Chances are you're going to need a speed boot on your characters. Once again, you can never be too fast, but you can be too slow. There are certain instances where you may use a defense percentage boot. It may be okay to have a slow defense-based character. For example, Tormund, because his passive doesn't rely on him taking turns, right? So if you really want a super tanky Tormund, you could make him with very high defense and a little bit on the slow side, since his passive just doesn't rely on him taking turns. Or you can put a speed boot on him, which would probably be the better option of the two, but up to you. So what about the mid to end game viability of the set? Well, it's really hard to say because there is no set in this game that gives as much increase to that defense stat. So none of the other sets give as much increase purely to the defense stat. So if that's the number one thing that you're looking for, let's say, once again, you're running your Ignatius or you're running your Solus as a nuker, and that is the number one stat that you're looking for, then you can't go wrong with the defense set. That is the number one way as far as sets to increase your defense. Now, there are other sets later on in the game that do increase defense, but they don't increase it as much. So they might increase defense somewhat and then increase resist, or increase defense somewhat and then increase HP somewhat. But nothing does as much as far as increasing defense than this defense set itself. So yes, if you're looking for pure defense, use the defense set. So yeah, you may end up using it end game because there is no set that directly replaces it. But chances are it's an early game set. So I wouldn't spend a ton of time farming this. All right, guys, onto the speed gear. So with each 2-piece set, we're looking at getting plus 12% speed. So remember, this speed, that 12% is calculated against the character's base speed, right? So here we see Rorik at a base speed of 96 for this particular level. Now, it's not calculated against your total speed. So that 12% is not calculated considering your gear speed, considering your speed with masteries and such. It's only your base speed. But still, 12% against your base speed is a ton. And this is why this is one of the most useful gear sets, if not the most useful gear set in the game, and one of the ones you'll be farming from early game to end game. So what subsets are we looking at prioritizing with our speed gear? It is speed. That's it. Really, you need that speed subset on all your pieces of speed gear, except a speed boot. All right. Pieces of speed gear without that speed substat are virtually useless. I know I said it earlier on, keep most of the pieces of gear, but one exception to this would be a piece of speed gear without a speed substat. It is virtually worthless. So what are we looking at with the glove and the chest piece? We're looking at really not the main stat, but we're looking at the substat. So we want to keep pieces with speed substats. That's it. It almost doesn't matter what the main stat is. If you have really good rolls on those speed substats, yeah, keep it. All right, so this is one of the only instances where really we're prioritizing the substat of the gear and not the main stat. So whatever that glove is, whatever that chest piece is, If you have good speed rolls on that piece, keep it. Now, what about the boot? We're looking at a speed boot ideally. So as I mentioned earlier, the speed set is one of the sets you'll be farming really your whole life playing Raid. So early, mid, end game, it is useful and it continues to be useful. Now Divine Speed, we'll talk about that later, but it's not as useful because it cannot be farmed. So really you're looking at your speed set for increases in speed. There are no forge sets that increase your speed as much as the basic speed set here. So if you're looking at pure speed, like your speed lead in the arena, etc., then yes, you're going to be using a speed set. You do not get anywhere near the increases in speed with any other set besides your speed set and divine speed. And guys, I would also recommend leveling up your speed gear as soon as you get it. So if you get new pieces of speed gear, at least level it up to 8 or 12 just to see where those stat increases land. Because if those stat increases land, especially multiple times on that speed substat, then you are going to immediately switch out that piece for any slower pieces, especially on your speed lead. So don't sit on it. Don't wait on it. If you get new pieces of speed gear, immediately upgrade it. Level 8, level 12. It's not that expensive. And yeah, if you get those double, triple rolls in speed, then absolutely, immediately, you will be using those pieces. Alright guys, onto the crit rate set. So each 2-piece set gives us plus 12% in crit rate. So what are the substats that we are looking at prioritizing? Number 1 is going to be the speed. Number 2 is crit rate, because that's the point of putting on the set, right? You need more crit rates. And number 3 is going to be crit damage. So what are we looking at for the gloves? Well, primarily we want crit rate or crit damage gloves. What about the chest piece? Any percentage chest piece. All right, any percentage chest piece. So HP, attack, defense. So what about the boot? We're looking at speed boots. So really, this isn't a set that you would normally put 3 sets on a character. This is a set where you may put 1 set on a character if you need them to really have that 100% crit rate. So because of that, this really isn't a set that you need to farm a ton. So what about mid-game to end-game viability? I would say it depends. As I said earlier, there's no need to heavily farm for that crit rate gear, but it's good to have a few sets lying around just in case you need to complete that 100% crit rate for a particular effect. Let's say you have a lure and you really need her to get 100% crit rate to land that decreased turn meter on her A1. Same thing with Armiger, right? He needs 100% crit rate. So in instances like that, crit rate isn't optional, right? It's really required to get a certain effect. So yes, it is good to have some crit rate sets around, but once again, normally you wouldn't be putting 3 sets on any character. So really you don't need a ton of crit rate sets. Onto the crit damage set. So each 2-piece set gives us plus 20% crit damage. So what kind of substats are we prioritizing with our crit damage gear? Number 1 is going to be speed, but number 2 is going to be crit rate. Why is that? Because a lot of times when we're maximizing our damage, we're going to end up using a crit damage glove. What does that mean? That means we still need to get our crit rate from somewhere, right? That means it's going to have to come from the substats. That is the end game way to maximize your damage. Use a crit damage glove and get your crit rate from substats. So really that's what we're trying to do here. So even though we're doing crit damage as the main effect from the set, really we're still prioritizing crit rate in our substats. Because if we're going to do the most damage, we already know beforehand, we're going to use a crit damage glove. That means we're going to need crit rate substats. So first speed, number 2, crit rate, number 3, crit damage. So what about the gloves? Firstly, we're looking at crit damage gloves. Secondly, we're looking at crit rate gloves. What about the chest? We're looking at any percentage chest. And what about the boots? We're looking at speed boots. So what about the mid-game to end-game viability of the crit damage set? It's very good. So you're going to want a good amount of crit damage pieces in your inventory. And in some cases, you may actually end up using 3 crit damage sets. So for example, Seer would be a good choice. Because even though a Karma Burden does scale off attack, it doesn't scale highly off attack. It scales more off crit damage. So 3 crit damage sets would work really well with her. Now, would it work better than, say, for example, a Savage set? No, it wouldn't. Savage would be better. But still, it would work better than an offense set. It would work better than a cruel set. Because once again, that Karma Burn doesn't scale highly off that attack stat, and that's the number one reason you're using it, let's be honest, for the karma burn, right? So there are certain instances in which characters, even though the damage may scale off attack, it may not scale highly off attack. It may scale more off crit damage. So in those cases, you may end up using the crit damage set more than an attack-based set like the offense set or the cruel set. On to the accuracy sets. So each 2-piece set here gives us plus 40 accuracy. So what substats do we want to prioritize? Number 1 is going to be speed. Number 2 is going to be accuracy. So that's the point of putting on these sets, right? And number 3 and 4 is going to be crit rate and crit damage in either order. Because really there are certain characters that not only do you want the accuracy for landing debuffs, but they are damage dealers at the same time. So once again, take for example Soulless, right? He does big damage, but he also has those debuffs, those provokes. So in those cases, it's nice to have some accuracy gear, not only with the accuracy substat, but with the crit rate and crit damage. So he can do big damage, but also land those debuffs. So for the gloves, we're looking at primarily HP percentage if we're talking about survivability, but crit rate or crit damage if we're looking at a damage dealer using the accuracy set. So what about the chest? We're looking at any percentage or an accuracy chest. So what about the boot? We're looking at a speed boot. So what about the mid-game to end-game viability of the accuracy set? You're going to be using accuracy sets the whole time you play this game. They are that good, and accuracy is that important of a stat. Because debuffs are so powerful in this game, you're going to need accuracy. Now, this set is directly replaced by perception sets, but nevertheless, chances are if you play this game long enough, you're going to have really good accuracy pieces, and those are going to be useful to you the whole time you play this game. So how much accuracy do you need? So for those of you who don't know, if your accuracy is equal to your opponent's resistance, then you have about a 92.5% chance of landing your debuffs. Now, if your accuracy is only 25 higher than their resistance, then you have a 96% chance of landing those debuffs. Now, the way debuffs work in this game is you can never get 100%. So no matter what, there will always be a 3% failure rate to land debuffs. But once again, plus 25 accuracy over the resistance will give you a 96% chance of landing your debuffs. So definitely always shoot for that. All right, guys, on to the resistance set. So each 2-piece set gives you plus 40 resistance. So what are we looking at for the substats? Number 1, speed, and number 2 is going to be resistance. So what about the gloves? Ideally, we're looking at HP percentage gloves. What about the chest piece? We're looking at either HP percentage or resistance chest pieces. And lastly, the boot, we're looking at getting speed boots. So are resistance sets mid-game to end-game viable? I wouldn't say that it is a priority to farm a lot of resistance sets, but yes, they will be useful to you in the mid-game and end-game. So it's important to have some good resistance sets because when you need them, all right? So maybe for a particular boss, you really need that high resistance number. Yeah, it's really important that you have resistance sets to help you out with that overall resistance number. Now for PvP, the resistance meta is sort of out right now, so people aren't really using resistance teams as much, and I'll talk about why, but it's much harder to build a resistance team nowadays. But still, for certain bosses, yeah, you need a high amount of resist, and having good resistance sets helps a lot with that. Now, this set is directly replaced by a newer set, the Fortitude set that you get from Baumel. So I know a lot of people can barely pass that guy, nevertheless farm him. But yes, this set is directly replaced by those sets from Baumel. So how much resistance do you need? Well, if you have 150 resistance over the opponent's accuracy and they try to land a debuff on you, then you're looking at a resistance rate of about 95%. So 150 more resistance than their accuracy gets you a 95% resistance rate against their debuffs. So similarly with landing debuffs, there is always a failure chance with resisting debuffs as well. So even if you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 resistance over their accuracy, there's still a 3% chance that their debuff will land. So you cannot completely resist debuffs all the time, even with super high resistance. There is always that failure rate. On to the lifesteal set. So each 4-piece set heals by 30% of damage dealt. So what are these substats we're looking at prioritizing? The first is going to be speed, and the rest is split between crit rates and crit damage. So what gloves are we looking at? Ideally crit damage, but crit rate works as well. What about the chest? We are looking at any percentage chest. And lastly, for the boots, we're looking at speed boots. It's very important to keep your speed up for your lifesteal characters because they need to take turns and do damage in order to heal themselves. So how useful is this set, in particular in the mid game and late game? So firstly, for early game, this set is very useful. And in fact, you can literally put all of your characters in lifesteal. Seriously, all of them for early game. You're going to find it works really, really well. Now, the lifesteal set is primarily a PvE set. So we're talking about campaign, dungeons, clan bosses, awesome. Really, that PvE content and early game is where the set shines. Where the set is not as useful is in PvP content. So if we're looking at arena, tag team arena, then this set is not as useful. But PvE, man, it's awesome. Early game, absolutely awesome. Literally, if you have the pieces, put every single one of your characters in lifesteal. It's going to be real fun. You're going to get a lot of usage and mileage out of your characters when you put them in lifesteal. There's just so much sustainability and survivability with the lifesteal set. And late game as well. So if we're talking about non-unkillable clan boss teams, definitely lifesteal is viable. If we're talking about certain bosses in this game, lifesteal is very viable. So for PvE, there is definitely a broad use for lifesteal early, mid, and late game. But for PvP, not so much. So the Bloodthirst sets that you can get in the Forge are a direct upgrade to the lifesteal sets, but nevertheless, keep your good lifesteal gear. Like I said, there is a place in the in-game for lifesteal gear. So in certain cases, you don't have to use a crit damage or crit rate glove. You can use an HP percentage glove. So these would be cases where you have the mastery, either War Master or Giant Slayer, and you're fighting a boss. So in those cases, now you can use that HP percentage glove for more survivability because you're actually doing more damage off the masteries, that is War Master, Giant Slayer, than you are doing damage with your crit rate and crit damage. So once again, if you're fighting a boss, you have War Master or Giant Slayer, then you don't need a crit damage crit rate glove. You can go with an HP percentage glove for more survivability. And that War Master Giant Slayer works in conjunction with lifesteal as well. So you can get huge healing when you're fighting those bosses. Now, if we're talking about enemy waves, even upper level, let's say hard Doom Tower enemy waves, War Master Giant Slayer does not do that much damage. It's really only against bosses. So in those instances against enemy waves, you're gonna want really the crit rate or crit damage gloves to do more damage because those masteries just do not do that much damage. So depending on what you're using your lifesteal for, it's okay to go with an HP percentage glove versus the crit rate crit damage glove. And lastly, one tip for healing in particular with bosses is running the trifecta here. Not only are we running Life Drinker, so we're healing for 5% of damage dealt, doesn't sound like a lot, but in conjunction with the lifesteal set, plus the War Master Giant Slayer Mastery, so these are skills that do damage based off enemy max HP. All of a sudden we're doing a ton of healing and a ton of damage as well. So if we're talking about a boss and you really want to get the maximum amount of return as far as healing from damage dealt, you're going to use a lifesteal set plus the Life Drinker Mastery plus either War Master or Giant Slayer. Alright guys, that is it for today. I plan this to be a multi-part series. But guys, let me know if this is useful to you. If breaking down the gear and their uses and what to keep and whatnot. If the way I'm doing it is helpful to you. If it is, then yes, I'll continue and I'll finish out the series. If it's not, no problem. I will find other things for you guys. I'll rack my brain and figure something else out. So once again, let me know if this is helpful to you. If you guys haven't yet, like, subscribe, and share so you can get me on that test server so I can come up with better strategies for you faster. All right, I will see you guys in the next video.